Welcome to the Good Faith Podcast. I'm your host, Curtis Chang. And the Good Faith Podcast is where friends who follow Jesus help each other make sense of the world. And these days, in trying to make sense of the world, it is very tempting to have our eyes glued on the latest news cycle. But what would it mean for Christians to step back from the news cycle and try to learn not from the daily news, but from history? If we wanted to do that, like which part of history, which era of history would we turn to, and what lessons would we draw? I recently read a very thoughtful article taking this historical approach. And it was published in the Dispatch, and it was written by Paul Miller, who is familiar with the Good Faith Podcast. Back in July 2022, in episode 36, Paul Miller spoke with our founding friend, David French. I unfortunately had to miss that episode, but they spoke about Paul's most recent book, The Religion of American Greatness: What's Wrong with Christian Nationalism. As background, Paul served in the National Security Council staff under multiple presidents, including George W. Bush and Barack Obama. He's now a professor in the practice of international affairs at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. Paul, welcome back to the Good Faith Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me back.
Paul, let's get into it, because your article provided some historical lessons, potential historical lessons for the American church today. And you went to the 1920s and 30s in Germany and talked a lot about the German confessing church. Now, for those who haven't read the article and are maybe not deeply aware of this history of the German church in the 20th century, can you provide a brief primer on that history?
Sure. Well, in 1930s Germany, with the rise of the Nazi regime, the Nazis tried to control and regulate all of the churches and make them join one large Protestant church and heavily regulate the churches and get them to toe the regime's ideology. A very small portion of the churches called themselves the confessing church refused to do so. And they tried to maintain the church's independence and its integrity to be faithful to what Scripture teaches. That's famously Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Karl Barth and several others. And many of those leaders ended up arrested, lost jobs, imprisoned. Many of them were executed, like Bonhoeffer. And so they were martyrs for the faith, trying to keep the light of the gospel alive in a very dark place.
Okay, that's a very dark historical sort of point to turn to say, hey, that's the part of history we should learn from. Make the case. What is it that we need to learn from, even as dark as that historical era is?
You know, the point of my article was actually to say, let's not think of ourselves in the 1930s. Because I quite often hear an appeal to the 30s and to the confessing church saying, we're just like them. We are facing the modern equivalent of the Nazis. And by the way, I hear a right-wing and a left-wing version of this, both of them accusing each other of being the modern Nazis. And that made me pause and think, maybe we're not in the 1930s, where there's one single obvious evil that unites all people of good faith and opposition. Maybe we're actually 10 years earlier. Before the confessing church formed, before the Nazi regime arose, following 1933, before then, there was in Germany something called the Weimar Republic. It was a kind of a shambolic republic that very few people respected or admired, but it was trying to hold the center against political extremists on the right in the form of the fascists, and on the left in the form of the communists. There was a very vibrant communist party at the time. And the Weimar Republic was just unable to withstand that political extremism. And my point in my article is to say that actually feels a bit more like our reality today, that we're maybe more like 1923 in the Weimar Republic with extremists on all sides than we are 1933 with one monstrous evil confronting us all. And if that's the case, what would it look like to be a confessing church in that situation?
Well, answer that question, because I'm dying to hear, because I agree with you. Like the weakness and the collapse of institutions in the Weimar Republic, I don't know, or I hope we're not there right now in America, but my goodness, have we seen the weakness of these institutions be exposed, in the last 5 years, in the last year especially. And so what if you're right? Okay, then we're actually in the 20s in the Weimar Republic. What then are the key lessons for a church that is seeking to be faithful to Jesus?
I do want to answer that question, but let me answer an earlier one, which is how
Yeah.
close are we to that?
Yeah.
I think we're alarmingly close. I think actually our republic is. I know I sometimes sound like Chicken Little, that the sky is falling, but I actually think pieces of the sky have fallen and are lying shattered on the ground.
Right.
People have been complaining for 100 years about the growth of the imperial presidency and about the decline of Congress. And I think that they've been basically correct. And right now we're reaping the fruit of a century of kind of decline in our Republican institutions. And I'm small r there. I'm not talking about the
Yeah.
Republican Party. Um, the checks and balances, the rule of law, our primary system, the political parties all have really atrophied and they don't closely resemble what they were supposed to be, as envisioned 100 and 200 years ago. So I think we're at a very critical moment where we're losing a sense of citizenship.
Yeah.
What I mean by that, a citizen, as opposed to a subject of a monarch, a citizen is supposed to be somebody who has an ownership stake in society, in the way we're governed, and has a equal standing to participate in our governance. I'm not sure I feel like a citizen these days. And that's not actually a partisan comment about Trump. I think that's been true for a long time, maybe for much of my adult lifetime. But I think it's accelerated over the past 10 years. I don't really feel like I think Americans have a tremendous amount of freedom and almost no real citizenship. We don't have a say in how we are governed in a meaningful sense. Yeah, we can still vote, but our vote is divided between a duopoly of two parties that most of us don't belong to and that only perpetuate their own interests and so on and so forth. So that's where I'm coming from. I'm beginning from the premise that our republic is already quite near collapse. I don't know if that means riots in the streets, but I do think it means alternate forms of governance like presidential decrees, like judicial decrees, like the tyranny of the majority, like mob rule. These are all other forms of governance that might wear the mask of democratic republicanism, but they're not really what our founders envisioned. But more importantly, they're not just. Rule by mob decree or rule by judicial decree, those are not just forms of governance. And that's what I fear is replacing a true republic.
And that's what, that's the case then for why we are in this Weimar moment.
Yeah.
The temptation then is for us to be like, as Christians, to think, well, should we shore up the republic? Should we is that really what the goal is? Or should we abandon the republic and go for one of these alternative forms? Or should we ignore it altogether? Yeah. Talk about those options and what we can learn from the confessing church as how to sort through these various options in a moment of regime, either transition or collapse, depending on how extreme you want to, use language you want to use.
I think as Christians, we should always be outspoken advocates for justice. I think now that's a vague statement. What does it mean? I think it always means the rule of law. I think that's a very basic requirement of justice, the rule of law, not of men. It's like the fish who swim in the ocean have no idea what the ocean is, right? We have lived our entire lives under a regime that purports to be under the rule of law. So we sort of have lost a sense of what it means to have the alternative, where just, people at the top make random decisions that don't apply to themselves. Recently the Trump administration officials, the National Security Advisor, Secretary of Defense, had a classified discussion over Signal chat, which was violating the law. Like, that was disclosing classified information in an inappropriate way. I worked in the White House. I worked in the CIA. I kind of know what classified information means and how to protect it. And they broke the law. And they're getting away with it. There's absolutely no consequence at all. They're just acting with impunity. That's what it means to not have the rule of law. That's what it means to have a class of people who are above the rule of law. And to be bipartisan, sure, I could point to examples on the other side. Bill Clinton's National Security Advisor, Sandy Berger, he broke the law in the same way to disclose classified information. And he lost his law license for it. So there was some accountability there. So it's not necessarily a new thing, but I think it's accelerating. under this administration. Okay, your question was what to do about it. I keep describing the problem because I'm so good at that.
As a true academic, Paul.
Exactly, yeah. A little bit harder to solution. Okay, so we Christians should advocate for justice. We should advocate for the rule of law. I do think that means we should advocate for republicanism, not the Republican Party, but the concept, the idea of free government that is more than just mob rule. Right. I'm not really talking about democracy by itself, just voting in elections. I believe in democracy within a broader Republican framework of checks and balances, rule of law, constraints on the executive, all the whole package. Right. And I think that actually we Christians should make a moral case for the goodness of that form of government. And that requires, first of all, we recognize that it is good and it is endangered. Yeah. And I think people are disagreeing on both of those. Some say, well, it's not actually that good. We should look for alternatives. I disagree. And other people say, yeah, of course it's good, but it's not really endangered. We're doing fine. America's the greatest place in the world. Yeah. And look, America is a pretty great place to live. I'm just trying to flash the warning sign based upon my read of history, my knowledge of how the rest of the world works. I spent 10 years studying Afghanistan. It's not a pleasant place to live. And I'm aware of how societies can fall apart. And so I'm trying to raise a flag here and say, look, if you think this stuff is good, it requires a fighting spirit to keep it. It doesn't just self-perpetuate. Republican ideals are not self-executing. They require Republicans, again, small r, who will actually advocate as bipartisans for the rule of law and the Constitution.
Paul, put yourself in the shoes of like our average listener who's like, okay, you're talking about abstract concepts, but like I'm a businessman, I'm a school teacher, I'm a pastor or something like that. It's like that sense of powerlessness, I think that's what a lot of folks feel in terms of powerlessness over what is happening in our regime, and whether it's Republican, operating with Republican virtue or not. Like it just feels like I have no power over that. That is a realm that is kind of so distant from me that they just, maybe I'll listen to a podcast, talk about it, but mostly I have zero power onto it. When you say that Christians should advocate for republicanism, advocate for the rule of law, can you imagine how that person that I'm describing could actually engage with that in a meaningful way?
I think many of us only encounter civic activity when we go to the voting booth. And once you've got to the voting booth, there's not a whole lot of choice left, right? You tick one of two boxes. That's about it. And so I think if you want to do something about it, you got to take a little initiative. It's going to be inconvenient. It's going to take up your bandwidth, but you got to show up to the local meeting of your party, your local PTA, your local county commissioners meeting. I joined the land use committee of my county government recently because I wanted to fight a development project. And it's super annoying. I don't particularly enjoy it, but like that's a way of getting locally involved.
Yeah.
And then once you're there, tell the truth and have no patience for lies or half-truths or spin or the BS propaganda that we all hear all the time, whether it's on Fox or it's on MSNBC. I'm tired of it, and I've just lost my patience entirely for it. And I'm to the point where I'm no longer terribly polite. When I hear it from somebody, I'll just interrupt and say, that's not true. Can you please talk to me like a human, not like a consumer? Because I'm tired of being treated like a consumer when I'm trying to exercise my civic responsibility and be involved. So I don't have tolerance for, again, lies or half-truths. I think that's a really one step everybody can take is to just put your foot down when you hear the lies and the half-truths and the BS.
But give me an example of, let's say a listener takes what you're saying and says, okay, I will show up for the caucus, for my local Democratic Party's caucus or my Republican Party caucus. What would it sound like to have a Christian voice, truly Christian voice that says, I will tell no lies here, and I will refuse to go along with lies here? What would be some of those lies?
Yeah. By the way, you're probably hearing the Solzhenitsyn quote in the background here, right? Which is, let the lie come into the world, but not through me. And that's kind of what I'm getting at. I don't have the power to stop it all, but I can say, I'm not going to be part of it. So I think Jesus calls us to be salt and light wherever we are. I'm not sitting here saying don't be a Republican, don't be a Democrat. I think that's not quite where we are. There is a line, by the way, beyond which I think you can't in good conscience, but I don't think we're there. I think it means if I show up at my Republican Party meeting, and I actually did this some years ago, I kind of talked to the local chairperson and I said, okay, are you still requiring election denialism? Mm. If so, I'm going to leave and not going to come back for a few more years. But if you're willing to listen to somebody who's going to tell the truth about the election, then I'll sit here and I'll be a part of the conversation. I won't tell lies about the 2020 election. I won't tell lies about January 6th, right? I won't tell lies about the rule of law or anything else, right? If you're in the Democratic Party meeting, it might be about gender and about the sexual revolution. It seems to me that there's a litmus test on the left where you have to toe the line and say certain shibboleths, and you get thrown out of the party otherwise. It might be standing up for a pro-life agenda in the Democratic Party caucus. Mm-hmm. I tell you, it's deeply uncomfortable. You're going to get ostracized. You're going to get bullied. You're going to get uncomfortable looks. You might lose friends. But that's what it takes to tell the truth.
Those are great examples. I want you to go back to the historical analogy you were drawing. Because you make this case in your article that if we are in that really kind of by the 1930s, the German Confessing Church made a strong stand and a heroic and martyred stance, but it was too late from a political vantage point, that really its moment of opportunity of influence was earlier. Can you say more about that, about why it needed to or could have thought about it earlier, and then kind of draw that analogy to this moment in American history right now?
So the Nazis came to power in 1933, and the Confessing Church put out the Barmen Declaration in 1934, kind of their founding document. And by 1936, I think quite a lot of the leaders were on the run. And I want to say it was might have been 37, 38, when it was sort of all over, and the churches had kind of lost, and the rest is history. And feel free, any listeners out there, to correct me on the timeline there. My point is that if you wait until the Nazis are in power, you might be too late. The time to confront them is when they're actually quite unpopular, not winning elections in 1928, 1930, and to be as loud as possible about the possible consequences. The remarkable thing about the Nazis, about the communists, about fascists, about Islamists, the remarkable thing about these movements is they're very honest about who they are and what they want. And it's not hard to see where things are going to go, especially if you have any passing knowledge of history. And so I'd say listen carefully to what we are hearing on I'll call it the nationalist right today. Mm-hmm. Listen carefully to what the progressive left is saying about what they want to do when they get back in power, and believe them, and then warn about it and say, look, this is something I say to my students right now. I've spent 10 years denouncing Trump. I've got no apology at all for him. But you know what I'm afraid of? I'm afraid of the almost inevitable leftist overreaction when they take power. And it feels inevitable to me. And it's so discouraging. This is, again, piece of the sky fallen for me. It just feels inevitable that when we get to the post-Trump era, and it'll happen here sooner or later, probably sooner, when we get to the post-Trump era, the left is going to just overreach and they're going to do all the bad stuff in reverse. And that's not going to solve the problem. It might undo some of Trump's legacies and just build all new bad legacies. Where's the principled leadership on the left? Where's the Sister Soldier moment by somebody on the left who's going to say, we're going to denounce the extremist on our side as well and aim for something more principled in the middle? I can't believe I just held up Bill Clinton as an example of principled leadership for the listeners who are old enough to know what a Sister Soldier moment is.
Yeah. All right. So what else? What are other lessons you would draw? Like one of the things you talked to, and you just talked about right now, was not giving our complete allegiance to parties. Say more about that, because I think, in this moment, if you, like me, are worried and have been worried for a long time about what Trump is doing, it's very tempting to say, well, okay, my only hope of saving the American Republic is the Democratic Party coming back into power. Your article, issues at least something of a warning against trusting or giving complete allegiance to parties to kind of solve problems for us. Can you say more about that?
Yeah. So I live in Virginia, where there's no party registration. We have an open primary, in which case I actually have never registered as a member of a party since living in Virginia. And so I have the luxury of saying I'm not a Republican and I'm not a Democrat. And for everybody who lives in an open primary state, I'd say the same thing. There's no reason to actually call yourself a member of one of these parties.
Mm-hmm.
I understand a lot of states, it's done otherwise. You do register as one or the other. But even then, if you're registered as a member of the party, withhold something from them, because they're not doing a very good job of governing America. And they deserve some of our contempt and our derision. Maybe contempt is too hard of a word, but I'm sort of losing patience. And it's harder for me to maintain some gentility here. I think the parties institutionally are so bad that they, even when we have to work with and through them to accomplish a narrow goal, we need to make it very clear that it's a sort of tactical cooperation and not a wholesale identity. I'll tell you, Curtis, I've had this experience so many times, and it's almost always on the right with friends and family, and it's on the left with my students, where I'm getting into a conversation and maybe a debate about a public issue. And I hear the other person, instead of listening and engaging, it's like a tape recorder starts playing. And what I'm listening to is not the person in front of me. It is the Fox News talking points they watched last night, or the MSNBC talking points they watched last night. And it's, I want to shake them, and I want to say, who made you the PR guy for your tribe? You don't have to do that. You don't have to volunteer as the propagandist for a tribe. You can actually engage as just a person, as a human and a citizen. I'm still struggling to understand why people do this, why they feel the need to give the talking point to defend their tribe when I'm not even sure they believe it, right? It's just like they feel this obligation to make sure I hear the best possible version of their side's argument or something like that. Do you know what I'm talking about? Have you encountered that at all?
100%, right? Yeah, absolutely. You feel like you're just talking to, like you said, a platform, not a person. Part of what I think you're getting at is, if we are to recover citizenships are of free and free-thinking human beings, people, not platforms. You can't have a true democracy or a true republic made up of platforms. They're composed of people, and I think that's kind of what you're getting at. I think.
I think that's right. Yeah.
All right, so I want to talk about another kind of historical warning, very related, which is nationalism. In your earlier appearance on the Good Faith podcast, you critiqued Christian nationalism in 2022, and you had this to say.
This Christian nationalism that you talk about in the book, why is it dangerous theologically? Why is it dangerous politically? What's wrong with it politically?
Nationalism is always treats some people as second-class citizens. It's always against liberty in some sense. Even the most benign nationalist regimes have cultural minorities within them. And how do you treat cultural minorities? Well, you end up treating them inhospitably by communicating the message, you're not really one of us if you don't conform to our prevailing cultural template, right? Every country in the world has cultural or ethnic minorities or religious minorities. And so the nationalist regimes face this conundrum. How do you treat minorities? Historically, if you just look at the practice of nationalist governments around the world, they almost always tend towards greater and greater oppression. Of course, at the far end of that, you have genocide and all that. But well short of that, you have legal status that disenfranchises or disadvantages minorities. And that's not consistent with the kind of ethic of an open society and equal justice, equal liberty for all that I think America stands for or should stand for. That's a big political problem with all kinds of nationalism, including Christian nationalism.
All right, so Paul, that was back in 2022. How do you see this playing out in 2025? What is different or the same of nationalism, and in particular Christian nationalism, 3 years after what you originally sounded the warning?
So I think I do stand by what I said. I think that is intrinsic to the nature of nationalism, that nationalism will always find a kind of an other or an outsider or a scapegoat, so to speak. What's interesting about American nationalism today, first of all, it may be moving from Christian nationalism to a post-Christian nationalism, which might actually be even worse than Christian nationalism. And as we saw in the election returns in 2024, Trump's coalition is actually more diverse, right? More ethnically and racially diverse than it had been. And that's an interesting finding. And it says that maybe about half the country thinks about race and hears language about race in a very different way than the other half of the country. Whereas everybody on the left thinks Trump is just incredibly racist. There's about half the country that doesn't think that, including many non-whites who don't think Trump is racist. All right, so in what sense is nationalism finding an other to treat as a second-class citizen? Well, it's immigrants. It's immigrants, and it is progressives. We're now drawing lines on ideological grounds and on citizenship grounds as Trump has embarked upon this deportation. And you got to be very careful with this. I think it's, of course, legitimate to enforce immigration law and to expect immigrants to obey the law. Like, that's all true. But the Trump administration has now been uncareful with who is deported and how. And there's some people who've been deported that shouldn't have been deported. And so it's pretty clear that the administration is using immigrants as the other, to define itself against. So that's, I think, where we're going right now. I think I'm a little surprised at the changing racial dynamics in the United States, where Christian nationalism, American nationalism, is more racially diverse than it had been even 10 years ago. So that's an interesting development, but I don't think it changes what nationalism is at root, and it is illiberal.
Illiberal, and as an ism, it is something that all Christians ought to be resisting as a idolatry, right? This is something that you wrote about in your piece, is we need to see the idols of our age, and any ism that casts itself as the authority, as the highest value overall, that trumps, to pardon again, that verb, that overrides sort of our Christian allegiances that are formed from Scripture about caring for the outsider, caring for the other, right? That becomes immediately something that is a warning sign.
And that's absolutely true. And every time I say that, I want to couple it with a celebration of patriotism, because I want to make sure that people don't hear me condemning America or condemning patriotism or condemning the love of your country. I'm not at all. In fact, I think the best way to guard against nationalism is a healthy patriotism. As I wrote in the book, I'm a veteran, I'm a patriot, love America, served in public service for 10 years, and I'm proud of that. I think patriotism is an attitude of gratitude. It's just being grateful. Hey, America's a pretty great place, and I want to make it even better. That's patriotism, and that's healthy. Defining America as a place for Anglo-Protestant culture only, that's nationalism, and that's unhelpful and unhealthy.
Again, I want to go back to this point that you were making, that, boy, it's too late if the Nazis have already arrived in power. The moment to act is earlier, before it consolidates its power. However, I did have this one thought, though, when I was thinking about that. I was like, okay, maybe it was too late to act publicly, politically, by the 1930s, and it should have ideally done so in the 1920s. But all these folks that ended up being martyrs, Bonhoeffer, Bart was not a martyr, but he was a leader who resisted them. Things were happening for them. They were going through things in the 20s. And the way I kind of almost think or wonder about it is, was there a process of spiritual formation where they were just wrestling through, where God was acting on them in the 20s, so that by the 30s, even though politically, from a political analysis perspective, it was too late, nevertheless, from a spiritual perspective, that was the time they needed to be formed. is there something to be learned from that? Like, if this is really kind of a 1920s moment for America, then that would say, like, what's the spiritual formation that needs to happen now so that we're ready for whatever comes afterwards?
Yes, that's fair. I think the way I'd respond to that is by saying, if this is our moment for formation, let's learn from the confessing church.
Yeah.
And one of the things we should learn from them is their witness was and remains important. It's honorable. It's a witness that resounds through the ages. Can we not echo that witness in our time and maybe more effectively, more, with more action behind it? It's when I say that they were too late, it's not really a criticism of them. It's more criticism of us. You understand? I'm using the history here to make a point about our moment. Maybe they didn't have the ability to do anything earlier, but I think we can, precisely because we have their example, precisely because we know history, precisely because we should be able to understand how these things play out. We can and should be able to act sooner than they did.
Paul, I got to ask you the question, since you are a student of history, when you look at, and of multiple houses, like you said, how societies can lose democracy and lose their democratic Republican institutions, like, how would you assess, like, is it preordained? Are we so far gone that that democracy is dead? You've got some people who are saying that, or is it, like you said, some people who are saying no, we're not even in danger? Like, in the spectrum of that, where do you place yourself?
Well, so here's one of the dangerous arguments you could get into, and I've heard this on the right. They argue that we've lost it, we're done, which is why we need a new authoritarian leader to, the new Protestant Franco, right? That's what we need, because chaos has broken out. And they use the George Floyd riots, they use the leftist gender ideology as proof that chaos has broken out, and thus we need to hand all power over to a new Protestant Franco. That's an argument on the post-liberal right, the nationalist, the hard nationalist right. Well, if you believe that, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Right. You actually become part of the problem of breaking down democracy, which you then use to justify breaking down democracy. And let's not play that game. Let's be sober-minded and realistic and historical, and note what's going on around us. I think, as I said, Americans still retain quite a lot of freedom. We still get to go to the ballot box and vote. I'm worried about the meaningfulness of that act. I think our political parties are, shambolic and corrupt and self-interested. I think Congress has almost completely ceased to function. I think the courts are actually doing okay. I think the courts are actually, with 40 years of the conservative legal movement, the courts are actually doing their job and exercising reasonable checks and balances on the others. The presidency, look, as I said, has been growing for 100 years. There's been the imperial presidency growing. And I sympathize with a lot of it because the national security state needs it, but we need the growth of accountability and checks and balances in line with the growth of the presidency, and that has not happened. And so I could cite you chapter and verse about everything that Obama did wrong, and a few precedents that George W. Bush laid down that weren't great. We could talk about Iran-Contra in the Reagan House. We could talk about Nixon, for crying out loud. What we're seeing now is the fruition of decades and decades of precedent that have now allowed President Trump to supercharge the imperial presidency, and that should be very worrying for all Americans. So your question was, where on the spectrum are we? What's the old adage from Hemingway, I think? How do you go bankrupt? Gradually and then suddenly. I think that's how societies collapse, gradually and then suddenly. I don't know how close we are to the suddenly, but I know the gradually has been happening for a long, long time. And that alone should be enough to wake people up. You shouldn't wait for the last straw to break the camel's back. You should stop putting straws on the camel's back.
Paul, I want to talk about another form of historical lesson learning from that German church, which is martyrdom. And martyrdom was something that, like you said, marked the most honorable expression, even if it, was an expression of the fact that they acted a bit too late. it's still better to be a martyr too late than not a martyr at all, right? And so it seems to me that there's something about martyrdom and the muscles that are behind martyrdom that Christians need to recapture. Not because, and I don't want to be alarmist, because I think, we're going to be called to actually physically die, give up our lives in the next, whatever, a few years or something like that. I actually think that kind of alarmism is dangerous.
Yep.
Because like you said, it justifies all sorts of extreme actions, either on the right or the left. But I'm talking about a martyrdom that the spiritual nature of martyrdom that says, you know what, this valuable thing, so maybe it's not life, but this valuable thing I'm willing to give up in order to be faithful to Jesus. Like, that's the essence of martyrdom, right? And so can you say, short of that, really alarmist moment when it's like, you have to give up your lives, which again, I think we need to be clear, we're not at that point. But we do need to develop muscles of like, hey, there's valuable things we were willing to give up. Like, even for example, some of the actions that you talked about of telling no lies. That's like giving up something of comfort. That's giving up social peace. That's giving up your reputation in order to be faithful to Jesus. Can you fill out more other things that we just, again, in that spirit of martyrdom, not quite death martyrdom, but dying to self, maybe is a better way to put it. What are some other ways that Christians need to be ready to be die to self, so in order for us to be salt and light in this moment?
That is a really good question. And you've put it very well, because I would agree we're not at the moment at risk in America of literal physical martyrdom, right? So let's be sober-minded about it. But there are things that we probably have to give up. And it might be sort of professional reputation and credibility if you stand up and say certain unpopular truths. It might be your tribal community. I think that's the big thing that you have to be willing to give up. I think human beings are naturally tribal creatures. We just define ourselves in groups. We flock together in groups. That's just kind of who and what we are. And it feels dangerous and alienating and alone to not have a tribe.
Yeah.
Trust me, I've been sitting here for 10 years with that one. And it's uncomfortable. I don't like it. I wish I had a tribe. But in this moment, when the tribes are leading us all astray, I think it's important to distance yourself from them. And that can be a form of giving up something.
Yeah. It's a death to self. I'm
thinking again about the people that we talk to who all you hear are the sound bites.
Yeah.
I wonder if the person who does that is grasping at the feeling of certainty that comes from belonging to an epistemic community.
Right.
Let me unpack that.
Yeah.
A community of discourse, of a community of talking points. You hear it on the TV, you feel like, oh, that feels true. And so you repeat it to your neighbors to be part of the team that all believes these things to be true. And when you stop doing that, you're no longer part of the team, and you no longer feel that sense of certainty of the world making sense. And things, you invite cognitive dissonance. Things might stop making sense. And that's just an uncomfortable place to be. But that might be the kind of martyrdom you're talking about, Curtis, that martyrdom of certainty, of self-righteous certainty, of knowing that my team's got all the answers. Stop with the talking points and sit with some uncertainty, and with the possibility that maybe your team's gotten something wrong once in a while.
Yeah. That sense of self, the sense of self that is identified, like you said, with a platform, with a party that gives you certainty in an uncertain world. I think that's a great point. I think that when we give that up, there is a death to a self that happens, and it is very uncomfortable, and it is both socially and personally. And it's so easy to want to crawl back to that kind of a certainty and assurance that of course, we're right and they're wrong, and we're good and they're bad. And there is a death to self that happens in that process. That is, I think, a pre-martyrdom, if you will, or kindergarten version of martyrdom that we need to, as Christians, need to be ready to embrace.
And I'll say this: I don't want to imply that there's a virtue in sitting in a place of doubt forever. When I say let go of your tribe's talking points in a sense of certainty, I'm not saying certainty is always wrong. it's a certain kind of tribal certainty. Oh boy, how do I say this? I have found it's much easier for me to find things to agree with on both sides of the political spectrum because I don't feel a sense of loyalty to either one.
Yeah.
And I can listen to a Democrat talk about poverty and like, oh, I agree with about 55% of that, and the other is just garbage. And it's just much easier to say that and to weigh things impartially or maybe dispassionately. And that is a new kind of certainty. It ends up being quite comfortable because I don't have to worry about what are they going to think of me. Are they going to ostracize me? Well, they already have. So what do I have to lose, right? And so it's quite freeing. And it does. So I'm not sitting forever in a position of doubt. I'm finding a new sense of certainty that is rooted not in one tribe's identity or the other, but simply in what I think is truth and natural law. And yeah, there we are.
Paul, I want to close by something that you've brought up that is personally very challenging to, I think, the kind of tribal identities that are around me here in the Bay Area, which is, I think, a lot of folks, including sort of believing Christians who are against Trump, are just thinking, they're just like white knuckling through, thinking that they have to just white knuckle through the next 3 years, and then there will be a new administration. The Democrats will win and put everything back in order as best as can. They won't be perfect, but they'll at least put things back in order. You've raised this real danger that's a sobering danger that may make some of my people think, oh my gosh, don't puncture this one, but that there is a great danger of kind of a left-wing version of Trump, basically, right?
Well, this is maybe one of the less popular takes I could offer, but there's a case to be made that that President Obama, whom I do respect, I think he was an honorable man, laid down some precedents that Trump is building on. And got to distinguish essentially between Trump, the person with all his chaotic and erratic stuff and his criminality, and the sort of the candidate or the official presence of Trump. Because Obama is not a criminal the way that Trump is. Obama's not erratic the way that Trump was. But Obama did he was a celebrity in the same way that Trump is. He had a power of rhetoric. So both Obama and Trump are extraordinarily gifted orators, but they speak in a different register. And Obama's rhetoric resonated with the left, and Trump's with the right. And they're both, I'm going to use the word demagogic. Trump is more obviously so, but Obama could be sometimes quite argue in bad faith when it came to discussing with the other side, dealing with Republicans on the Hill. And I don't, I think that was a bad precedent. He himself was building on prior precedents that goes back decades and decades. I'm not saying it came from Obama. I'm just, this didn't all start in 2016 with Trump. He didn't invent this style of politics. It's been part of American life for a long time. So I would love it if the left could maybe see with clear eyes the way that they have contributed to the problem, that laid down some precedents that Trump and others have built upon. That's an uncomfortable conversation that is probably not going to be welcomed on the left, but that's the answer to your question. Yeah. That's the way it could happen. Now, let's imagine the future. I don't know who it's going to be, Gavin Newsom or somebody else, inheriting the presidency after Trump leaves it. And it scares me. Particularly if Trump gets away with it because he's got the House, the Senate, and the courts, more or less, And imagine somebody like Newsom with a similar trifecta and with maybe a liberal majority in the Supreme Court. Not only will they undo everything Trump's done, but they can go further in a leftist direction. Imagine the worst caricature of, I hate the word, wokeness, right? Imagine that, but imagine it given the authority that Trump is now giving to his anti-DEI campaign. Yeah. I would not celebrate that. I would not celebrate the next Democratic president enforcing their version of DEI at the point of law and regulation in the Supreme Court. So Curtis, does that make sense? I'm trying to be fair and again, not be the Chicken Little, but I do think it's a distinct possibility that the next the next administration will use the tools that Trump has left them.
Yeah, well, I mean, we talk about in our work, like the After Party, about the importance of how versus what in terms of our politics, and that applies to the left just as much as it does to the right. And it's, I think, an important point of the prophetic role Christians can make is that the Christians on the left advocate, support, try to be the kind of political voice that tries to rebuild the sort of rule of law and the sort of ways in which democracy really reflects, I think, the image of God, that we were made in the image of God. So that's as much on the left as it is on the right. And I do, I am sobered about the fact that the tracks are being laid such that the same danger could be happening. Paul, we're going to end here, but I want to ask you, and maybe put you in a unfamiliar position as first somebody who's worked in policy, and then also as a professor. I'm going to throw a third P at you. So not from a policy perspective, not as a professor, but put on a pastoral hat and speak to the Christians listening to this. What's your final word to them? How do you want to warn them? But then also, how do you want to encourage them?
I have right above my desk here a plaque that I had custom made just to remind me every day. And it's from Ephesians 4:15. It says, speaking the truth in love. Tell the truth, but tell it with love. Tell the truth, but tell it with love. Half the time, I feel like I'm just not hearing truth from people. And then the other half of the time, it's people who want to tell the truth, but be as trollish and unkind as they can about it. Look at me, I'm being brave, tell the truth. Tell the truth and tell it with love. And if we all did that, that would solve quite a lot of our problems. Jesus, if you want to follow Jesus, speak the truth because he loves the truth. He is the author of truth. In him are no lies. And every time you tell a lie or a half-truth or a misinformation or a distortion or an exaggeration, you are dishonoring your king. So tell the truth. And tell it with love because he loves you and he loves your political opponent. And he loves every person. And if you demean the person to whom you're speaking the truth, you are dishonoring your king. So speak the truth and speak it in love.
That's a great pastoral moment. I think you've missed your calling, Paul. I think you should have been a pastor in addition to these other things. Paul Miller, author of A Confessing Church for America's Weimar Moment. It's a great article in the Dispatch. We'll put links to it. I heartily encourage you to read it. Paul, thank you for coming back on the Good Faith Podcast.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much, Curtis. Appreciate it.